All right. Well, welcome everybody. Appreciate everyone joining us. I'm Bill Adair. I'm the director of the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy, and appreciate everyone joining us. This is somewhat of a last minute event, I guess we could say. This was a great opportunity. David offered to do this when he saw that we were doing some election related events, and so we decided to take him up on this wonderful offer. It is with just 4 days before the election, couldn't be more timely, and we're thrilled to have David join us for this. David is an important member of our community, has been a great Duke alum. Usually, David, I see you during basketball season because you and Eric will email and say, hey, we're going to be in town. Any classes you'd like us to speak to? So I'm particularly thrilled you're willing to do this when there's no basketball.
That's just coincidence when that happens, I'm
sure. It is, so let me tell you a little bit about David. David is, it seems to be in charge of whatever is important at ABC News, has been in charge of their breaking news coverage, and most recent, and for as long as I've known you, I guess you've been in charge of special events, which seems to me to be just one of the most important jobs at ABC News, putting together important coverage like the election night coverage that we're going to be talking about tonight. But the last time we talked, when I came and saw you in your office a couple of years ago, you were in charge of the streaming service, and maybe at some point you can talk about that and about how that is to some extent the future for the broadcast networks. But we're thrilled to have you with us today to talk about election night. And I'll frame it just by saying that over the weekend, I watched 537 Votes, a new documentary on HBO that was about the Florida recount in 2000. And many of you will recall that this was a real turning point in election night coverage. It was a moment when the networks rushed and made some calls about who won the 2000 election that were incorrect. And I think that moment, and you can talk about this, David, were informed a lot of what has happened since, in the 20 years since, and I know is in the back of your mind today as you look at what you're going to do Tuesday. So with that, welcome. It's great to have you at Duke, at least virtually, and appreciate your doing this.
Thanks, Bill. Thank you guys for having me. I'm glad to take a break from our election preparation to do this. I was actually saying to Bill that it's good to step back from the weedy stuff that we've been working on over this week, and just to talk about the election writ large. By the way, I had the best job in the 2000 recount. For those of you who know Florida, I was in Palm Beach, staying at the Breakers. I don't know how that happened. So I didn't want the recount to ever end, but unfortunately it did. So it's great to be with all of you. I've been at ABC News for a long time. I'm currently, as Bill said, the executive producer of special events, to produce big live event coverage and live breaking news. I've been doing election night coverage since 1994. In 94, my role was to sit next to the person who changed the numbers on our mechanical scoreboard. So times have obviously changed with the stuff that we do. Really, the last month and a half, I've been focused very heavily on preparing for election night. We're going to go on the air at 7 o'clock at night. Our stated off time is 2 in the morning. We have plans to be able to stay on all night through Good Morning America and into the next day if we need to, because we think that that's a distinct possibility. There's a ton that goes into preparing for an election night, and I'm happy to talk about any of it, from where are we physically anchoring our show, who is our talent, what are the major themes that we think are important. Some of them are pretty obvious this year. How do you use graphics and video to tell the story in a clear way? Who are the guests that you book? How do you use technology to help tell the story rather than distract? Some of you may remember CNN ventured into holograms, and it became a joke, and it actually distracted from the story they were trying to tell. So it's important to us that the technology that we're trying to use, is it going to help us tell the story? And then this year, of course, we have added challenges. Coronavirus creates just a ton of operational and safety challenges for our teams. So the studio will be less dense than it normally would be. Our teams in the field are, where they are will be dependent a lot on where they can be. It's also preparing for an election where we don't know if we will know who won at the end of the night. That's not anything we've ever really prepared for before in a real meaningful way, the way we are doing now. And of course, the other is, and part of this is the role of the media in general in society, but preparing for an election at a time when there's some concern about, what will happen in the country if there are no results for many days, and what's our role as a responsible member of the media in helping to frame what that means. Probably most importantly that I would say is that we're trying to be prepared for every outcome. Usually it's one person wins or the other, and this year there's the real possibility that we don't know that night who will win, or even the next day, or for days. So one of the things we've talked about a lot, and I think that'll come through on the air, is that a slow count or slow results don't necessarily mean something is wrong. And there are polls that show that Americans understand that. I saw one that said 2/3 of Americans understand that the vote count may not be done on election night, and that a similar number are fine if the results are announced days later. And we bring a lot of teams to bear. Obviously, our political team, we have a huge, what we call our ballot watch team, which is a team that's really focused on how votes get counted, how fast they get counted, all the potential legal challenges that are out there, and what laws govern this, state laws and federal laws. So we'll be focusing a lot on that. And of course, we learned a ton of lessons from 2016. And we can talk a little bit about what those are if you want. In 2016, I was in charge I was the executive in charge of our polling unit. So I have some pretty good insight into polling and how we've changed and what worked and what didn't work. And this year I'm working very closely with Nate Silver and the 538 team. I would just say one thing, and I said this to Bill yesterday. I'm not a huge political junkie. I mean, I like it, but I don't live and die by it. But I love election night because it's a great time to show images of people voting and people, being involved in the democratic process, whether they voted for the first time or the 40th time. And often at the end of our coverage or any coverage you would watch, there's the anchors and correspondents talk about how wonderful it is that there's going to be this peaceful transfer of power and this great American tradition where one candidate, candidates accept the will of the voters and one candidate concedes and the other one accepts, and that they all pledge to work together. And it just feels different this year. Hopefully it won't come to pass that happens, but we are preparing for the possibility that some of the things we've taken for granted for as long as I've worked here, we maybe can't take for granted this year. So I think Bill and I talked about opening it up for more of a conversation than a lecture. So that's really all I wanted to start with. And I'm happy to talk about anything. Okay, Bill, why don't you show the picture? So we'll give a sense of the complicated nature.
Yeah. Megan, if you can enable screen sharing for me.
So on election night, I will physically be in our control room in New York. We have, because of COVID, we actually have 3 control rooms that all of our people will be spread out across.
Sorry, wrong slide.
That was.
Let's see, one sec here.
So we'll be in a. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Bill.
Just talk a little bit while I'm pulling it up. What people are going to what they're going to see. So you're in the control room, and what are you controlling, and who are you talking to at that point?
Right. So I talked to a number of the anchors and the correspondents, a number of the people who are doing graphics for us, our political unit team, our decision desk, which is the place that makes the calls or makes the projections. I shouldn't say calls. details on election night. And, you know, being a live television producer, I think the hardest, the biggest challenge was just being able to, saw it there for a second.
You did, all right. Maybe
Yeah.
you're seeing something different than I'm seeing. All right.
Saw it for a second. I don't know if other people are seeing it yet.
Yeah, I've seen it twice, Bill.
All right, there you go. Are you seeing it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is my view from my desk, from my seat in the control room on election night. That the man standing kind of on the right of the picture, he's our director for the show that night. To me, one of the biggest challenges is just like kind of absorbing all of the inputs, visual and audio, that you have on election night. There's something, you know, there are hundreds of monitors in there. That panel on the bottom left is my headset, where I'll be talking to upwards of 30 or 40 people over the course of the night. I have multiple computers. And so part of the challenge is just making sure you're not overwhelmed with information. I guess that's part of the challenge of all of us these days. And that, you know, you don't get so deep into the weeds of what you're working on that you lose track of what the actual story is on election night. And that story, especially on election night like this, will change over time. And the early results we have may not necessarily be indicative of the results later in the evening or the final results. That's always the case. It's particularly this year because of the number of people who are voting earlier by mail, and the ways that states count and report those votes. So that's that in a number of states, key states, and we could talk about a couple of these, that the early vote will often be just kind of one kind of vote, and the later vote that's reported would be another kind. So you could see one candidate ahead in the vote count early into the evening, well into the evening, and then suddenly it shifts when some of that, especially the mail-in and absentee vote, gets dumped in for some of these states. I'm talking specifically about Wisconsin, Michigan, to some extent Pennsylvania. Florida actually has the opposite, where a lot of the early vote will come in first. So you may have a situation where Joe Biden is ahead in Florida early, and by later in the evening, President Trump has caught up, or he may be ahead. But so this is my view on election night, where we'll be, you know, our biggest challenge is like, when do you drink the Red Bull? Is it before you go on the air? Is it in the middle of being on the air? What snacks do you have with you? And just like kind of steeling ourselves with the possibility that we're going to be in there until, you know, noon the next day.
You mentioned Nate Silver. Take us through the decision process with Nate and others, and how you decide about states. In watching what happened in 2000, just like you go through every 4 years, just making a call about a state is a big decision.
So we have a few different groups, right? So our decision desk, which Nate is not part of, they're the people who take the vote, take the exit poll, use modeling, statistical modeling to project the races. And every network has a decision desk. And most of us get our vote count and our exit poll information from the same company. It's called Edison. So our decision desk is sequestered. There's no editorial input into the decision desk. They project states when they feel they're ready to project them. My assumption is this year they will be more conservative than in the past, in part because projecting a race often is based on, well, historically, how did certain counties or precincts vote? Much more difficult, I think, this year to predict that, because the vote is different. It's so much more early vote than we've ever had before. So they will be much more cautious about making historical comparisons. We have a demographics team that analyzes the exit poll for why people voted the way they did. So that, there's a big question there that voters get when they leave the polls, coupled with a phone questionnaire for all the people who voted early. And that gets at questions like, what was the most important issue for you? A lot of information on people's gender, race, and stuff like that. So we'll be able to slice and dice the vote to see where there are certain groups that fuel the victory for one guy or another. Then we have people like Nate Silver and his team. They do a lot of number crunching. Obviously, Nate's got his forecast. Nate's forecast, it's not magic. It's based on statistical analysis of a lot of polls and other information that's out there, and they put it in, and it changes not based on the magic formula, but based on new information. Interestingly, this year, Nate will not be changing his forecast on election night as results come. His forecast will lock on midnight before election day, and that will be his final forecast. He will obviously weigh in on how, if Florida goes a certain way, he will note how that, theoretically impacts or will impact, would have impacted his forecast if Florida had gone that way. And Nate and his team are also doing a lot of deep dives into the vote return and looking at, for voting patterns. And we feel very lucky to have someone like Nate and his team. They're just so smart, and their statistical analysis is pretty impressive.
And so that final decision, ABC News calls North Carolina for whichever candidate. Who is empowered to make that decision?
So just our decision desk. They're the only ones who can make it. They are sequestered. They're not. There's no editorial. There are no editorial people in the room with them. We don't say that we call. We project. It's not our job to call a state. And some of you may have seen the controversy over the Supreme Court decision recently in Justice Kavanaugh's. He wrote a concurrent opinion where he basically said, unless a state, anything done after election day is suspect. A lot of us thought that was kind of crazy. States never call the state on election night. Most states count votes for days, and there are laws about when they actually have to officially certify the vote. It is certainly never on election night when that happens. So our decision desk will say we are confident enough that we can project that this state, it's often when they feel it's mathematically impossible for the remaining vote that they think is out there for the guy who's behind to catch up. And again, why I think they'll be cautious is that that's often driven by historical, what's happened historically, and this year it's going to be a little bit different.
And how much pressure do you feel from the other networks? Seems like if we go back to 2000, that was that cascade that led to the calls that Gore had won Florida prematurely. How much pressure do you feel are you or someone else keeping an eye on the other networks?
We keep an eye on the other networks. I mean, I don't. We have some people that we've asked to keep an eye on the other networks, but maybe not for the reason you think. Because it's kind of a moot point. It's not like another network calling it is somehow going to impact what our decision desk is going to do. They're not aware of what other networks are calling, and we're not telling them. We have people watch them because we want to make sure, I hope this is never the case, that if they have an interesting storyline or thing that they're covering, or something that they're doing on their air that is different from what we're doing, we want to be aware of it to make sure it's kind of a gut check on what we're doing. I can't say that's ever been the case that we've noticed something different. It is a little. I will tell you, I've been in the control room where other networks have called the race for president 10 or 15 minutes before we have. That's a little surreal when you have images of people at the winning candidate's campaign headquarters cheering, but we can't say why they are cheering. I think each election we get more and more transparent because I think the audience appreciates that with that information. So many years ago, we might not have shown the crowd because that would have been disjointed. I think now we would say, the race has been called for this candidate by some other networks. We're not there yet, but that's why you see those people celebrating. I do believe, especially all news viewers, but younger news viewers appreciate that level of transparency. And we say what we know, we say what we don't know. Kind of pull the curtain back a little bit. So I don't think we'll be shy, of showing if Joe Biden wins and people are erupting or if a network projects that he'll win and we haven't done it yet, I think we'll show it and we'll say another network has projected that Joe Biden is going to win. We're not there yet, and we'll explain why we're not there yet. That's a big part of our election.
And you mentioned lessons of 2016. What are those lessons?
Yeah, I mean, look, there were three big lessons that I jotted down. I'm going to go to my notes. One is in polling. So there's been a lot of analysis of polling, and the national polling was pretty spot on. You know, I think that the average of all the national polls was Hillary was going to win by 2%. She won by something like 2% in the national vote. Of course, the national vote is not what determines who the president is. It's state polling, and state polling in 2016 was not very good in a number of states. It's very expensive. Local news organizations often who did state polling didn't have the money to do it well, and we were not doing enough state polling. So this year we're doing a lot. We and other organizations are doing a lot more state level polling than we did 4 years ago. You may have noticed you're not seeing any tracking polls, which are those daily polls leading up to an election. I think nobody's doing those this year. I think the thing about polling is it's one piece of the overall puzzle, of the overall reporting puzzle. It's not the be all end all. So I think we've kind of put it in its appropriate place. I've done a ton of. I mean, at ABC we did a poll in Iraq after the war. I mean, I'm a big fan of the use of polling as a reporting tool. But it's just that it's one reporting tool out of many. Two other changes. I think our newsroom, or a newsroom writ large, needs to be diverse, not just in the classic sense of diversity of, you know, we need more African Americans, we need more Hispanics, we need women and men. We need to make sure that our newsroom, and an organization that's based mostly in New York and Washington, has people who grew up all over the country, right? So that the conversation in our newsroom is more reflective of the conversation of parts of the country. And I think a lot of newsrooms have woken up to the fact that for a lot of reasons, even if they were diverse in kind of the capital D ways, they were not diverse in terms of people who grew up in Oklahoma or in the Dakotas. And so we were missing enough voices there that I don't think we appropriately understood the country that we should have in 2016. And another way I think we did it is you have to get out and be out in the country and report in the country. And expensive to do. I think our decisions in years past were fueled a lot by, it's a lot of money to fly around with these campaigns. I think we realized we have to fly around with the campaigns. And for the people out there, spend as much time looking around the camera and as you do looking through the camera. I mean, you can hear the same stump speech and pay attention to the candidate, but pay attention to the people who are coming to these events. One of the things I've said to our people covering Trump in the last week or two, as he's been out doing these big events, is who are the people who are at these events? I mean, separate from the coronavirus issue, who are they? Are they people who voted for Trump 4 years ago? Are they the diehards? Are they people who didn't vote for Trump 4 years ago? Are they independents? Are they people who voted for Hillary? Are there first-time voters there? Like, that's going to give us, I think, a better sense of the enthusiasm and the breadth of the enthusiasm for him than just like what he said in his speech. And so it's an easy trap for the media to get caught in. You know, he throws shiny objects out to us every single day, maybe more than anyone else ever has. But to be disciplined in thinking about, like, how do we really understand where the country is? There are a lot of ways to do it. We just have to focus on it.
So speaking of Trump, do you give him airtime anytime he wants it on election night? If he comes to the podium at the Trump Hotel in Washington, is that just, you're going to cover it no matter what?
We've had conversations about this. I don't think we are in a situation where we would not go to him. I do think, though, that if he is, again, this is a hypothetical, right? So let's say we have not projected the race, and we're at a place where it's not like we haven't projected it, but we know where it's going, but we haven't projected it because we don't know results in a ton of states, and that neither guy has a clear path yet to victory. If he comes out and kind of declares victory, I think we would cut away from that pretty quickly and say, okay, you just heard the president declare victory. ABC News is not there yet, and here's why we're not there yet, and here's why we think he's being premature about it. And I think so. I think we're not going to censor him, but I think we'll make like a contextual sandwich out of it. We'll contextualize it before he speaks. We will contextualize it after he speaks. And there may be a lot of that going on depending on how the night goes. I just think we're gonna we're going to be trying to be steady and we're certainly not going to throw up every tweet that lots of people put up. We're going to be pretty focused on what we know and the information that's coming in, and that is vote return. That's the exit poll, and that's to some extent, our reporting on how the vote is going in these different states.
Well, what an extraordinary moment that would be, to basically sort of like, okay, you've heard what he said, here's what we know so far. That must have been a challenging conversation to talk about that.
Yes, it was a challenging conversation. There's not unanimity in that decision. Look, based on so never before have I been so kind of immersed in how different states count and report the vote, or different counties within states. So for example, Wisconsin, which is a key state, the early and absentee and mail-in vote gets kind of reported last. So the day of vote will come in first. So very likely that Donald Trump is winning early in the evening. Like when we put up our board that shows Wisconsin, Donald Trump will be winning in the raw vote. Assuming that he's going to get more of the day of vote than Joe Biden. Assuming Joe Biden is going to get more of that other vote, then his numbers will start to go up later than Donald Trump. The interesting thing I heard is that historically, Milwaukee is the last kind of voting area to dump their absentee votes in. So in a year when early absentee mail-in votes are bigger than ever before, Milwaukee arguably is going to be Joe Biden's best area of Wisconsin. The most pro-Biden vote may be the very last vote that comes in, and it may not come in until 3 or 4 in the morning. So I've never had to know that before. That was not something that knowing that has a huge impact on how we contextualize what we say when we show a board with 30% of the vote in and Trump is up by 7 points. Again, I'm just making stuff up. How we say, here's where the vote is now, but why we think it might tighten. And then our decision to stay on the air past 2 in the morning might be driven by what are we hearing from state election officials about when that Milwaukee vote is going to get dumped in. Are they going faster than they thought? Are they going slower than they thought? Did they decide to pack it in and start the next day? Most of the states have told us they're going to keep working through the night until they clear their decks. But there are some states that have told us, they're not going to be. Well, some states are accepting votes for days, if only they were postmarked by election day. So if a state is very close, it could easily take days for that state to be called. At some point, our decision desk, again, the people who do projections, they'll say, listen, this state is too close for us to project. We are no longer in the projection business. This is now going to come down to the state declaring a winner simply based on vote count. And that happens, that happens often at the end of the night. If we get into that kind of situation, then we will be waiting as long as it takes the state to certify or to declare the winner.
Sure. Let me invite our audience. If you have questions, go ahead and type them in the chat. We've got a couple. I'm going to ask one more, and then I'll go to some of those. Let me ask you about the production itself. How much is it scripted, particularly, I presume at the beginning, there must be sort of blocks and you sort of know, okay, we're going to go to such and such in this time frame. And then how much is it really just you make calls on the spot?
Yeah, I mean, our first 20 minutes or so are pretty heavily laid out. They're not necessarily scripted, They'll be like written anchor copy for about the first 2 or 3 minutes, which is intro stuff, setting up the night. But pretty soon after that, we're going to get into real-time election results, and you can't script that. But we do have a sense of how we want to start the night, how we like to get to our results, who are the people we want to talk to. The guy who's doing exit polls for us, the guy who's doing deep dives into the different states and how the vote is going. All of our pundits are people at Trump headquarters and Biden headquarters, some of our correspondents in the key battleground states. We've talked through that a lot. We've also talked about when at 7:30, 8, 8:30, 9, 10, 11, 12, 1, when there are poll close, how we want to start those half hours or hours with the latest results. We've also talked about, who are the people we'd like to hear from that night. But even those are what we call in the world soft bookings, because, a person we think in advance we might want to talk to may become irrelevant depending on how the story goes. So I have a rundown for the show, and it's basically like blank except for the commercial box. Like you can see, this is later in the evening. There's kind of nothing in here. There's just the commercial breaks and then just stuff, and we fill it with whatever's going on.
Could you tell us who's going to win North Carolina?
Yeah, right. If I knew that, I'd be in a different business than this.
That's fascinating. And how many correspondents will you have out around the country?
We have 15 or so correspondents around the country in the key battleground states for the presidency, in some states where there's some key Senate races. I mean, the second big story of the night is control of the Senate. So we're in some of those key states. Some of those states overlap. We have people at the Trump headquarters in Washington, the Biden headquarters, which will be in Delaware. And then we've got our team in New York, but because of COVID, some folks who would normally be on the set, they're from remote locations, from their homes or from studios of where they live, where they'll be. And those teams that are out in the field, they're talking with our political unit. They're dealing with our ballot watch team, or the folks who are talking to like the secretaries of state of the different states. And so there's a lot of interconnectedness and a little bit of overlap, which is on purpose among our teams. I see an interesting question that from Tiffany Sherman that I want to answer about polling and how that changed because of no landlines. So I was talking with the people who do the exit poll, the official exit poll for election night, and it's actually exit poll is the wrong term now because the majority of voters in a lot of states don't go to the poll, so they're not exiting the poll to be interviewed. It's kind of three different things. There is an exit poll election night or election day for the people who are voting on that day and leaving the voting place. There are entrance polls for the states that do early in-person voting, so they're kind of do their version of the exit poll, but they're standing in line with the voters now for the states where early voting is happening, so we capture the early voters. And there are telephone surveys, and those phone surveys now, they don't just use landlines, they call cell phones too. I actually just got a call from a poller on my polling organization on my cell phone earlier today. So they mix those three things together to create the exit poll. The real challenge this year is, are they getting the right proportion, right? So in a particular state, because these are all state driven, if they overestimate the percentage of people who will vote early and mail versus in person, then the exit poll won't be as accurate as if they got that, that mix correct. And that's a huge challenge for pollsters this year. This has never happened before. There are some estimates. If their estimates are off, then the exit poll may not be fully accurate. It's never fully accurate, but that's one of the reasons why it may not be accurate, is if they just don't get that mix right.
And here's a good one from Grace Abels. During election night, most eyes are pointed at a television screen, but so many networks. How does ABC draw those eyes and remain competitive while not rushing to judgment?
Yeah, it's interesting. We talk a lot about these events where all the networks have the same information, right? A debate, an election night, the State of the Union, right? Like there's not real difference in like the raw materials that we have to build our shows. So are our graphics as kind of cool and informative and modern looking as possible? Are we utilizing technology in a cool way? So we're using augmented reality in our studio to show results. I mentioned in the beginning, like there's a fine line between using augmented reality in a cool way and using it for just because it's cool and you lose focus on the story. Like I said, I thought CNN did that. Like if you ever seen Bloomberg and you look at their screen, like it's a little overwhelming the amount of information they have on there. Do we have the best voices? Do we have people who were just that the conversation is interesting? Bill mentioned in the beginning that I oversaw our streaming service. So we have a 24/7 streaming channel called ABC News Live, which you can get on any number of the streaming, Hulu, Roku, a lot of different places. So they'll be simulcasting our show. One of the things we're doing different this year, we're not doing a different streaming show from our show. We're doing one ABC News show, which we're distributing to all of our platforms. But understanding that streaming news viewers are often younger than the people who are watching us on television, are we focusing on the topics and doing the show in a way that we think appeal not only to kind of the classic demographic for a network news viewer, but for a younger demographic, right? So are we talking about social justice? Are we talking about climate change? Are we talking about issues that younger news viewers tell us they're more interested in than older news viewers? And again, is our presentation modern? Again, one of the things I think we were doing anyway, but it's being accelerated, is just that level of transparency and being able to say, like, here's what we don't know, and here's what, here's why we're not calling this, and kind of having that conversation, I think is good for us to do.
And who are your anchors and commentators, the main ones?
Yeah. So George Stephanopoulos is our main anchor. He's like when you say, oh, that guy's the smartest guy in the room, like George is definitely the smartest guy in the room, which is very intimidating to be his producer, because sometimes you get the look from him like, that's dumb. And you're like, oh, he just gave me, that's the dumb look. And we have 7 more hours of broadcasting to do. That's intimidating. David Muir, who anchors World News Tonight, he'll be on set. He's really focusing on the exit poll, that why voters voted the way they did. Lindsay Davis, who was one of our main anchors for the live stream, ABC News Live, is with us. We have kind of the pundits we've had through a lot of the election cycles, so Chris Christie and Rahm Emanuel, who are kind of they're a fun duo and they go at it. Yvette Simpson, who really represents the more liberal wing of the Democratic Party. Sarah Fagan, who is a Republican pollster. We have Matt Dowd, who's worked for a number of campaigns, the Bush campaign. Matt's also in and will be in Texas, which is an interesting state this year. So Texas is interesting. We've got a guy who lives there. We can talk about the big demographic changes there. Nate Silver, as mentioned, a guy named Tom Yamas. He's kind of doing for those of you who watch CNN, our John King magic wall, where we really dig into the states and see how the vote is going county by county, and how much of the vote is in, what percentage of that is early vote versus day of vote. A bunch of our correspondents. Byron Pitts will be in the field for us. We've got a great Ballot Watch team: Terry Moran, Dan Abrams, Kate Shaw, who is a constitutional scholar, and Pierre Thomas, who kind of covers the FBI, who's looking at the whole question of election interference and disinformation, violence. Hopefully there is none at the polls that night. And then obviously we have a big booking operation. So trying to book the winners and the losers and the people who run the parties and big stinkers, who, hopefully late in the night, if we have a sense of which way it's going, people can tell us, what does that mean? What does that mean about the country? And I'm not just saying this, we have truly spent half of our time thinking about who do we want to talk to if Biden wins, and half who do we want to talk to if Trump wins. I think, I would not be surprised if Donald Trump wins, just based on our 2016 experience. Like, it just behooves us to do that. I wouldn't be surprised if Joe Biden wins. I also wouldn't be surprised if, we tell people we'll be back on Wednesday, Thursday.
All right, question from Maya Miller, one of our students here in our journalism program. If absentee ballots can still trickle for 6 to 9 days after Election Day, is there a possibility the networks make a projection on election night and then have to change it after more votes are counted, and the counts are certified?
So based on 2000 in Florida, I would tell you one of the worst things we could ever do would be to call a state and have to take it back and call it the other way. It's just like, it's that and killing someone who's not dead are like the worst sins in network television news you could possibly do. So we're not going to do it, but legitimately, so our decision desk I'm going to make up a hypothetical. Our decision desk will look at a state, let's say it's Florida, and they'll say Donald Trump is up by 75,000 votes in Florida. They will look and see how many votes do they think have yet to be counted. That's not an exact science. They don't know. They're not going to project Florida until they think that the number of votes until they think that it is impossible. There's not enough Joe Biden votes out there to dig into that deficit that he has. So if Joe Biden is down 75,000 votes and there are only 75,000 total votes outstanding to be counted, well, then you're pretty sure that Trump is going to win Florida. Now, that being said, that's so close that they won't make a projection, because I believe in Florida there's an automatic recount if it's within 1 percentage point, and that 75,000 votes would be within 1 percentage point. So almost, it's not, they don't have like an exact rule, but they will never project a race that is within 1 percentage point of the vote. So if Trump has 50.2% and Biden has 49.8%, if I did that right, they will not make a projection. They're going to say they're going to wait for the state to make a call.
And how about in the other statewide races? Like we have a governor's race here, and we have obviously a very hot Senate race. Is your decision desk making projections there, or are you waiting for the counts?
So they'll be projecting all of the 30 some odd Senate races that are out there, with a particular focus on the ones that we think are the competitive races. They will also be projecting the governor's races. For the House, during a presidential year, for the House, they really just project who will control the House. We'll spend very little time on individual House races. We may go into some of the House races late in the evening. Again, if there's a trend, there are some particularly interesting House races that talk a little bit more about just the country. There's a woman in Georgia who's a QAnon follower who is going to win her race in Georgia because she's running unopposed in a very Republican district. So there will be someone who's a proponent of QAnon in the Congress next year. So we'll likely talk about that at some point, because it gets you into the broader conversation of QAnon and the future, where we go from election.
There's an interesting race here, in fact, that Maya is covering in it's sort of this goes between Charlotte and Fayetteville. This is the Timmons-Goodson-Hudson race. Hudson's the incumbent. And it's one where it looked like Hudson was safe, and then Maya picked up that there's that Timmons-Goodson's raised all this money, and Hudson started to go very negative, and suddenly the Republicans are pumping a lot of money into the race. And that's another race to watch as sort of a bellwether in North Carolina, because if that race were to go for the Democrat, it would indicate a real.
Yeah, it was interesting. Kentucky, because the polls closed in Kentucky early, and I believe Kentucky is a state where some of the state, the polls close at 6 Eastern, and then some of the state is 7 Eastern. We don't make projections until 7, but it means we get more vote in Kentucky. We get vote faster in Kentucky than many other states. So we often look there, and there's an Andy Barr who faced Amy McGrath last time. He won, Andy Barr. We expect he'll win again, but looking at how close that race is another bellwether we'll look at. Although, again, I would say 2 years ago during the midterms, early in the night, Republicans were doing well. And then by the end of the night, it ended up being, as we saw, a pretty big blowout. So even, the bellwethers are useful to a point. And, we used to do a briefing, an internal only briefing about the early exit poll information at like 5:30 in the evening after the embargo was lifted. And there would be a discussion about who's ahead in each state. We're not doing that this year because a little bit because of 2016, a little bit because of just the facts of how the early vote may differ so substantially from the later vote. And anything, we certainly don't want to go into the evening with preconceived notions based on potentially inaccurate information. So sure. As long as we kind of keep in context everything, that there's lots of different streams of reporting, I think we'll hopefully do a good job. And again, just admit to our audience, we know what we know. We don't know what we don't know, and repeat often as a public service. Just because we don't know something doesn't mean something's wrong, right? Like slow does not equal wrong. And the other thing I would say is I used to be in charge of news gathering for ABC. Every election, I would send an email saying, do not alert us when your cousin's aunt tells you that there was a trouble at a polling place. Like there's always trouble at a polling place. Like, voting is messy. And long lines or machines not working does not mean there's a systematic problem with your vote. That's just, that's what happens when, a bunch of 80-year-olds run voting machines, in a place. And we have to make sure that we are on top of the news of the day, but that we're not overhyping, if in one polling place there is a scuffle in the state of Michigan, we'll know about it. We'll be aware of it. We're going to make sure we're not making a national story out of something that's not a national story. In part because, we get to help. We might be spreading bad information there and spreading information that some bad actors want us to, that things are out of control. Right? One fight at one polling place in the country of 350 million does not mean things are right.
Sure. Judith, our dean has a question. Judith, do you want to unmute and ask?
Thank you so much. Good to see David, as I said, an alum doing such important work. My question was really, normally we think about calling an election. We think about, okay, we're counting. Looks like this person's going to get more votes than this person. We feel comfortable that that's going to be the result. We're going to call it, right? But now we're in a situation where we are aware that there are either ongoing, pending, or people ready to press buttons on litigation in different places. And I'm just wondering, or there even in different states, there are possibilities that we know of where the Electoral College and the electors may choose to act differently, et cetera. So there's so much in play that can actually change whether the counting translates into who becomes president, or what transpires and how are you guys thinking about that in terms of what your job is on election night?
Yeah.
How what you do on election night actually ends potentially up playing into that game afterwards?
Yeah, it's actually, in part, it's like, this is all very complicated, but we shouldn't make it more complicated than this. There is we get very good information on vote and on the vote return. And our decision desk has really smart people who model out that vote return, coupled with the exit poll, coupled with historical data, coupled with other things. We don't call them calls. Our projection in a state is really going to be based on the voting, on the evidence of voting. And it's going to be that we are comfortable that based on what we are seeing, based on the vote we have in, based on what we know about the area where the vote hasn't come in yet, we're comfortable saying that the guy who's behind can't catch up. It's just mathematically impossible for him to catch up. And that's when our decision desk, other decision desks will project a state for a certain candidate. Other than Florida in 2000, I'm not even sure we called Florida. That's never been wrong. Like, that formula has never been wrong. There've been plenty of times when we just haven't been able to make a projection because it's too close, or we're not comfortable with the information we have. That I think is much more likely to happen on this election than in past elections. It's a separate and parallel for us thing of how are the parties, the candidates going to challenge the vote, whether it's in courts or whether it's in state legislatures. Those things may meet at some point, but they're not going to meet on election night, right? Like there may be lawsuits. Those lawsuits on election night are not going to impact, I can't think of a reason why they would impact the vote counting on election. Our job is to understand what are the laws in the states and the federal laws, like how would a certain lawsuit, go ahead? Like, what's the process? What are the next steps? There have been so many, part of what's interesting about this election is even now there are ongoing lawsuits that are changing how the states are going to count their votes. The Supreme Court made 2 rulings last night, I believe, from North Carolina and I think Pennsylvania again.
Pennsylvania,
yeah, that impacted how votes will be counted. I mean, it's
and then those could go back to the Supreme Court.
Right. And obviously the new Supreme Court justice, there's a lot of questions about how the Supreme Court may impact this election. That's one of the topics for discussion for us on election night. And we're preparing a lot of information. So those 2 things exist in parallel for us, where we can talk about, here's what we know about the vote and where we can make a projection, where we can't. Put all that together. Do we feel like we have enough information to declare a winner that night or not? And what's the status of how the vote count is going in a particular state? And it's really for later in the evening when we start drilling into particular states. Let's say this election is coming down to Florida and Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. We know all the rules in those states, and they differ in those states. And we will know where the vote count is in, like which counties and which counties it's not. And so we'll be able to have really interesting kind of cool, getting into the nitty-gritty detailed discussions about here's what we're waiting for in Wisconsin. We're waiting for Milwaukee. And we may stay on the air and just keep saying we're waiting for Milwaukee. And then we'll start reporting. We'll be calling the Milwaukee election officials and the state election officials when you're going to get that vote. And that's cool. That's like great fun journalism where we've got vote count coming in, we've got our analysis coming in, we've got real actual reporting happening, people who can contextualize it, and then it becomes potentially a really fun, interesting night. I think there are three early states: Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, and I would include Arizona. So those, Arizona's later, obviously. Those are 4 states that Republicans won 4 years ago. If Biden wins any of those states, it's really mathematically difficult for Donald Trump to win. I mean, just like pure math, unless something else goes really haywire. Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina, they count their vote pretty fast. So we could, hypothetically, theoretically, have a good sense of the evening relatively early, or not, depending on how those states go. If early on we could call one of those states for Biden, one of those states for Biden, then you're just getting to kind of like, you can start doing simple addition on on your whiteboard about Joe Biden's path to 270 electoral votes and Donald Trump's path to 270 electoral votes. And that's really interesting. And I mean, the other interesting thing that I always find fascinating is why people voted the way they did. Like, is Donald Trump really going to lose suburban women? Is Donald Trump going to lose older voters? How do Hispanic voters vote in this election, particularly in Florida, but nationwide? Are there every year, every election, we say young voters are really going to come out in force, and they never do? Is this the year that they do? And obviously, the early vote this year, and how that breaks down. There's going to be tons of interesting stuff to chew on that we'll talk about the country to some extent. And even if Joe Biden wins, Donald Trump will get 40% of the vote, whatever that is, more than 40% of the vote. So talking about how the country kind of moves forward is, if we have a winner, is a fascinating thing for us to talk about all night long. So I'm not worried that we have enough to talk about. I'm very interested in kind of, I'd like to know, oh yeah, we're going to know a winner or we're not going to know a winner. But that remains to be seen.
Here's another question from Tiffany Sherman. You mentioned you will take Trump live whenever he steps to the podium. Will you do the same for Biden?
Yeah, we will. I mean, if you remember 4 years ago, Hillary never came out, and Trump came out at like 3 a.m. So it's not like, we'll probably have a long time to make these decisions. But yes, we would certainly take both of them. Again, if either one of them is making a claim that we just feel that's actually not, you can't, we're not going to let either one guy make a victory speech if we don't think that he's necessarily going to be the victor. Like, we might do a little bit of it, but then we feel like we'd have to, for our audience, kind of cut away from that and say, well, here's what the facts are right now. That's part of our job. I think, Tiffany, interestingly, one of the things we'll talk about is, I presume Donald Trump will be tweeting a lot on election night. How do we handle those tweets? What do we do with those tweets? And do we ignore them? Do we play them? Do we do some of them? I mean, it's almost always, it's kind of a cop-out to say it depends what they are, and we will have to see. But it depends what they are. And so we'll have to see. And we do have, we have our kind of key decision makers with us in the room to the extent that they can by COVID, or at least with us on headset. So we make real-time decisions on a lot of those, weighty kind of capital J journalism decisions, about that kind of stuff. I mean, I and my team, we don't make that in a vacuum. And generally, our posture is always like, more information, as long as it's good information, we'll get that.
Who would have thought that we might need fact checking on election night on the things that the candidates were saying? Election night used to be the night where they just came out and congratulated each other.
Well, that was my point in the beginning about, every year I have our team gather great video or photos of people voting, whether it's like that first time voter or the 102-year-old who votes. I always think that like it's important for us after all this to say that like election day is actually a day for the people, right? It's a day for people to vote, and it's a great day for democracy. And those images remind us that it is. And part of that was this tradition of one candidate concedes, they call the other, that one is gracious in victory, and then our system moves on, and there's a peaceful transfer of power, and that that all of that may not happen. Like one of the other discussions is if Donald Trump loses on election night, will he give a concession speech? We don't know the answer to that. So we've talked about all of that, and how are we going to handle it? One of the people we're sad not to have with us this year is Cokie Roberts, who passed away, but she was kind of our resident historian and was great about connecting us to the past about why some of these things endure over all these elections. And so it is a little sad that we've lost some of those traditions and some of the things that were norms throughout this election, throughout the last many years.
You bet. Likewise, watching the documentary, I was reminded of Tim Russert and the role he played. How just was that sort of calming force like Cokie was. And Cokie was here just a few years ago and gave a wonderful talk with our students.
Yeah, Tim, if you remember Tim Russert, for those of you who remember Tim Russert, one year he got out a whiteboard and he started just doing math on the whiteboard. It was a great aha moment because it reminded us that fancy bells and whistles are not necessarily the way to go, right? It's like a bells that like allows people to kind of into the to understand how these elections work and do the math. And we've tried to do a lot of things that are they utilize cool technology, but they are at their heart kind of basic, like what if we move this state here, it's addition and subtraction. It's not higher level math. It's interesting. Tiffany just wrote she used to be involved in TV, but she's kind of glad she's not this year. Yeah, there's a lot of days when I question my career choice. And like when I talk to Bill's classes, I'll be like, "What's your number? Your top advice?" I'm like, "Oh, don't be a journalist."
But isn't it? How does election night stack up compared to all the other things you do? Is it exhilarating? Is it exhausting? How do you do you look forward to it? Sort of how does it compare with conventions and other things you do?
Conventions to me they're just boring. They're just boring, like that we still do the conventions. To me, I scratch my head a little bit. They're not news events. They're productions. I love election night in part because we don't know what's going to happen, and that it's a real left brain, right brain challenge, right? Like we have to be prepared for so many different things, kind of editorially, intellectually, be able to discuss so many things. We also want to be able to have a compelling visual presentation for our show that explains it. And doing both of those things at the same time is hard. So election nights to me are fun, given their level of complexity. They're definitely stressful, especially like when we start getting toward the big hours when they're poll closing times. And about 10 minutes before poll closing time, our decision desk will tell us what they've projected for the races where the polls close 10 minutes later. Those are the worst 10 minutes of my life, in that like scrambling to get everything prepared in 10 minutes. And I love it. I also love like when we're doing things that are not horrible news stories, so election nights generally are not horrible news stories. We did the space launch of the SpaceX thing. There's great space launches. Those are fun. Royal weddings are fun. The election of a new pope, with the white smoke, black smoke, like those kind of things are fun. And especially things that involve like where there's lots of people and you get to see emotion and kind of help take the country or the world through something that is emotional to a large group of people. The installation of a new pope or an election night is that. Those to me are really exciting. And did you put cameras in the right places to capture that? Much more difficult this year because of COVID, but being there to capture the emotion and thinking in advance, like where should we be? or maybe a place that, is not an obvious place to be, but that would, I think there was an earlier question. Someone said, you all have the same information election. How do you keep yours? Part of it is we try to think about, like, what's a cool place to be. So I'll give you a little secret for us. Don't tell anybody. So in addition to having augmented reality in our studio, which is really cool, and we have a way to—
Can you explain that? Like, what do you mean by, like, is everybody wearing those goggles?
No, so literally maps fly out of the floor, and the Capitol flies out of the floor and is like, is in the middle of the set for the viewer. And our cameras can rove through it but it's not really there. It's just, it's augmented reality. So if George Stephanopoulos says, let's take a look at the map, the floor will open up and a map will pop out of the floor with the latest results. Or if David Muir has an exit poll, a cool 3D graphic will pop out of the floor. We have a cool thing where the map flies from this huge monitor wall to the floor, and it flies through the set onto the floor. The other cool thing is we've taken over a huge screen at the South Street Seaport that ESPN controls, and we're corporate cousins with ESPN. And so we'll have the ability to have these really beautiful kind of New York City skyscapes with information in that screen, whether it's the map or the latest results or video. So we're really excited to use that, to start the show, to go in and out of commercial, again, to hopefully make it like just creative, right? And an interesting show that you want to watch. I was jealous. CBS did augmented reality on the Washington Monument for Super Tuesday, where as Joe, the candidates were going, they were going up the monument, and they actually, I thought they didn't use it enough. I thought it was just cool. It was a cool visual way to show something, different than just numbers on the screen. So
you were starting to tell us your secret
Well, the secret is our South Street Seaport camera, and our to some extent our augmented reality. Obviously, for us, at the end of the day, our secret is our talent. We just think we have great people, really smart people who will be able to analyze the vote and the exit poll, and contextualize it, and can talk about what it means and where the country goes from here. And so we spend a lot of our time talking about who do we want to have talking about election night, and making sure we gave people their roles and responsibilities early so they could be studying up on the things they didn't know.
Another question from Grace, curious about how commercials work on election night. What kind of advertisers does it attract? Yeah. Are political ads allowed?
I don't know the answer to if they're allowed, but since the polls are pretty much closed, I doubt that anyone's spending, I doubt any candidates are spending political money for us on that night. I don't remember seeing, I don't pay attention to the ads, but so I don't know the answer to that, but I don't think there are political ads. They sell pretty well. I mean, especially nowadays where on network television, so like the regular entertainment shows don't get that big of an audience. On nights when there's big live events like this, or the debates or those town halls, we're getting more people than generally watch network news on a regular entertainment night. So there are lots of advertisers who are interested in doing it. For an event like this, where for other events, there might be some, the advertising people might say, hey, is it going to be a problem or just weird if we have an ad for prescription drugs or something like that? On this night, we don't think so, but we have a format. I showed you that rundown. Some commercials can shift during a half hour. Some, we have to hit commercials at a certain time for local stations to be able to do their news cut-ins, usually like at 25 and 55 past the hour. So, one of the big things, we have an associate director whose really only job is to count us into and out of commercials, let us know how much time we have, for the individual blocks.
Cool. Well, let me ask one last question. Let's get your projection. Can you project when we're going to know who our next president is? So
I have no idea. I really have no idea. Anything I told you would be a guess. And after 2016, I should get out of that game. I think so. So I'm gonna completely cop out on your question. Right? Either we will know at 11 o'clock, or we will know at between 3 and 5 in the morning.
But you think we will know before sunrise Wednesday?
I do, but I would not be surprised if I'm wrong. You know, I would not be surprised if I'm wrong because I mean, I have my sense based on what we all see, right? Like polls and reporting and where the country is and things that are going on. I have my sense based on now my really good understanding of how and when states report their votes. And then I have just the sense that actually, that's if everything goes right. You know, if Milwaukee or Detroit or Philadelphia, if things are slower than possible, then we may not know for days. And you know, that is highly possible. And again, I would just leave you with, as you're watching election night that night, and you know, you can wow your friends. Some of the last vote that we will see on election night will be the vote from heavily Democratic Milwaukee, heavily Democratic Detroit, and heavily Democratic Philadelphia. And the last of that last vote will be the early vote, which I would submit is probably even more heavily Democratic than the in-person vote. So if Donald Trump is winning in those 3 states, even at 11 or 12, you might be able to say, well, hold on, has the vote come in from Milwaukee, Detroit, and Philadelphia? And you'll look really, really small. And we'll see, depending on when that stuff comes in, and also depending on what happens earlier, we may or may not know. But a lot of that is just like me hoping, because I don't want to, you know, I don't want to sleep in my office for 5 days. I really want to go home. So that may be skewing my my call on that.
You and me both. David, thank you so much. First, before we wrap up, I want to thank Megan McLean for putting this on. Megan did a lot of work to promote this, and want to thank Megan, and also our co-sponsors from Demon, Amy Unell and her great team for helping us put this. David, thank you so much. This has been really fascinating. I'm looking forward to seeing things fly out of the floor on ABC. This will be cool. And hoping it's not too late at night and we get some interesting insights into what's happening. And thank you so much for being involved, alum. We appreciate it. Sorry you can't be here for a basketball game. We'll give you a rain check. Not sure when we'll have in-person games again soon, but look forward to seeing you at one soon.
Megan, since you said that and since you recorded it, send me the recording so I have that for 2022 or whatever that is.
Those DeWitt Wallace cheats. Yeah.
Thank you guys. It was great to do this. I had fun.
Thank you so much. It was great.
Thanks a lot. So long.
Bye-bye.